Good evening, everybody. My name is Vivian Walker, and I am the co-president of the Public Diplomacy Council of America. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's panel discussion about employment opportunities in academia for foreign service and public diplomacy professionals. In our last session, we looked at opportunities in adjuncting and faculty positions for foreign service and public diplomacy officers transitioning out of diplomacy and into the university sector. This evening, we will be looking specifically at opportunities in program management for international students and U.S. students and faculty on university campuses. We'll also be looking at ways in which foreign service and public diplomacy officers might contribute to the internationalization of the university sector through university-supported fellowships and programs for international scholars, efforts to bring international scholars into the classrooms, and community events that feature international speakers and other programs. To help us think through some of these opportunities, we are very fortunate to have a distinguished panel of experts who have a unique combination of diplomatic, academic, and leadership experience in international education. We'll hear first from Fred Bohl, who is currently the Executive Director of the Global Learning Hub at UC Davis. He's a former Foreign Service officer who had oversight of Department of State education and exchange programs, and a lawyer and legal scholar with significant experience in international human rights and humanitarian law. He will be followed by Dan Kramer, the Director of the International Studies Office at the University of Virginia. He is a former director of the Fulbright U.S. Student Program at IIE, and of course, in that capacity, he worked extensively with the Department of State, and he has, of course, his own academic experience and expertise to include time spent as a former Fulbright scholar. Finally, we'll hear from Amir Reza, Dean of the Babson Academy for the Advancement of Global Entrepreneurial Learning and Dean of Global Education. He is the past president of the Association of International Education Administrators and has held numerous leadership positions in international education and cultural development. So as you can see, truly a distinguished group of panelists. The great Senator Fulbright, whom we've mentioned earlier this evening, once said that educational exchange can turn nations into people, contributing as no other form of communication can to the humanizing of international relations. I think it's true that foreign service officers, public diplomacy officers are experts at turning nations into peoples and putting a human face on diplomacy, and as such, they are uniquely qualified to support the internationalization of American university campuses. So over to our panelists to help us explore how that can happen. So let's now begin with Fred Bohl.
Thank you, Vivian. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks also, of course, to the Public Diplomacy Council. I'd like to begin on a point that is not directly related to the topic, but is general, and that is that for people who have left the Foreign Service, I would avoid using the word retired. It's something that the department uses, it's something that we talk about a lot, but in fact it gives a completely wrong impression of where one is in life and what one's intentions are, especially if one wants to find a job. It's an internal issue. I would absolutely not use that word. I use the word I left. And I'm very direct about that. It's important to be giving an impression that you are moving toward something. It's very, especially for those who are leaving or have had to leave in difficult circumstances. One, let me say how much I regret it. But it's important to be able to say, I'm taking a new step in life and that you are moving towards something. Academia is its own world. Higher education, and that's our real topic tonight, not just work in academia, but in higher education. is its own world, and it doesn't necessarily understand the foreign service world. It's important for any applicant to be able to translate that experience to something that is meaningful in an academic in a higher education context. One can't assume that people will value service, that they will know what it meant, and there's nothing bad or good about that. It's just this is a different world. Hollywood is its own world, the business environment is its own world, and academia is its own world. And anyone can get into it. It is absolutely possible to get a job in higher education, but don't take it for granted, and you need to be able to make a case for yourself about your own interest, why you are moving toward this. A first general point I would say is that it's important to highlight any and all ways that you have supported and interacted with higher education in your work. That won't be taken for granted. And it's important to say, so anything that you can point to is of value, direct or indirect. There are many opportunities in higher education. So think to the time before you joined the department and what your knowledge was of the department and the U.S. government. If you're like me, like I was, I had no clue that most departments in the U.S. government do international work, that you could work for the Department of Energy or Interior or the SEC, and in fact have lots of people doing international work in an international context, that you didn't just have to work for the Department of State or USAID. And if you think that way, you will begin to understand to look at higher education in the same way. There are international aspects of what a university does throughout the university. It might be headed Department of Biology, right? But in fact, the content and the job is very international, and you can make a very good case about why you're a good candidate for it. So look for opportunities in many different parts of the university. Don't just look at departments called Global Affairs or International Student Services. Look widely and think about the many things that the university does. It's managing grants, it's looking at programs, it's helping students engage. And universities are just as how shall I say it, complicated as the department is in the way things fit together. People don't always talk to each other. People don't always like each other. People sometimes create little fiefdoms on their own, which also means opportunities for candidates who are looking at a university. So definitely, think about that. Joining as a staff member does mean that you fit into a certain place, and in general, there is a sort of an informal pecking order in universities. Tenured faculty members rule the roost, followed by untenured faculty members, followed by staff. And that's simply something one has to understand and be ready to work with. I've always felt supported and certainly very well treated, but it's important to understand when thinking about how to engage, how the place actually functions and what the dynamics are of its governance. And in a university, the academic senate is the place where things begin, and that has an effect on hiring decisions and on how things actually work in practice. So look at individual departments for jobs, not just those with an international character. Be mindful of the specific job requirements. Like any place, the university is probably using AI to do initial triage of applications. So make sure you tailor your application to the job. Look carefully at what it entails. Schools do not do things the same way necessarily. The way we run international student services is, for example, not the way many universities do. Our international services office does not do international student recruitment, for example. That's the Office of Admissions. Many places do it completely differently. So do enough homework about the specific institution and about the specific job you're looking at to be able to make a pitch, to be able to make your case. for jobs that involve international student services, which many PD professionals, of course, would be attracted to. You also want to make sure that you highlight your visa experience, consular experience, and not give it short shrift, and not simply say I did a tour once. It's something that you want to play up and probably do some additional homework on. What does it mean for a university? You need not just to know how visas work, but how optional practical training works, how to deal with USCIS in terms of extensions of status. Have reviewed, just like for the Foreign Service exam, right? Have reviewed what's going on in the press lately and be ready to speak to that, because that's what universities are thinking about. They're looking for applicants who are conversant in these issues and who are ready to help them go through what is currently perceived as a very difficult time for handling and supporting international students. Be mindful about the nature of managerial experience. That's something that many Foreign Service officers have had that they don't talk about, that is a wonderful asset for a university, to be able to manage people and what that means in practice. Come up with specific examples. Oftentimes I see in interviews people don't really bring specifics to the table, and yet that's what's making a difference for the institution, how you would handle an individual case. Certainly, as you've already spoke, as there has already been a webinar on academic jobs, I will simply say there can be jobs that involve both an academic component and an administrative component, but they're relatively rare. The two are generally separated. What will often happen is that someone who is in an academic, in an administrative position, may be able to negotiate teaching one course, a first-year seminar. Schools do it in different ways. So it's something to think about. Is that part of what the school is proposing? It is something that they want, or in fact that they're not looking for, because expectations matter, right? They're looking in terms of, well, what are your expectations? You're coming from a different world. Does this person understand higher education? And will they get when we say, no, we're not really expecting that of you? So be ready for that, right? Have thought about that in advance. I would say that any opportunity you have currently to teach and get experience in an academic environment is absolutely something that will be valued. Even if you're going for a different kind of job, any kind of experience matters, and is something that you can certainly play to. It makes you much more credible as a candidate. So look for opportunities. And of course, when you are applying, look for anyone you know at the institution who might even be able to serve as a general reference. It makes a huge difference to be able to have someone from the world of academia to recommend you for a specific position. And lastly, before I end, let me simply say it's a privilege to be here. These are times when we all need to support one another, and I hope very much that all of us will be mindful about what this means for also supporting the United States government as we go forward and at some point have to rebuild much of what is being lost. Back over to you, Vivian.
Great. Thank you so much, Fred. I particularly appreciate your focus on the skill sets that foreign service officers and public diplomacy officers in particular have, and how those skills can be highlighted and transitioned into the university or academic environment. Before we move on to our next speaker, Dan Kramer, I just want to remind all those of you who have joined us in the last few minutes that there will be an opportunity for Q&A at the end of these presentations, and you can submit your questions in the Q&A function box that should be at the bottom of your screen. And our excellent program coordinator, Lam, can assist you if you have any questions about how to do that. With that, we will transition to our second speaker, Dan Kramer. Over to you, Dan.
Great. Thanks so much, Vivian. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak tonight. I guess my situation's a little bit different because I started in academia, and I was a faculty member for 10 years and then had the opportunity to take over the Fulbright program. My predecessor in that role had been there for 48 years, so it's not a role that comes up very often. But the opportunity to kind of give back to the Fulbright program and to work closely with the State Department was one of the things that attracted me to moving on from academia to take an administrative role, which is something I had been doing while I was an academic, and that was something that really appealed to me to see how that might work. But I always had in my mind that I might boomerang back, and it was trying to find the right fit. And what you were saying, Fred, about that, in terms of how I transitioned, I actually had in my email moving on. It wasn't about leaving; it was so much about moving on, and it was important for me to be able to articulate that. I did take a couple of things right almost from your playbook. The place I was looking for was something was going to be the right fit that would fit for my skill set that I had, being able to teach on the one hand, and I plan to do that to run some study abroad programs. It's the one thing that I actually missed. But I also looked to see what the structure of the institution was. I'm fortunate that my boss, the VP for Global Affairs, is Steve Moll, who is the former ambassador to Poland and Lithuania. So I was looking, and this is something I would recommend, looking for people who have worked in the federal government, who are there, who understand where you're coming from. And I wanted to make sure I wasn't coming back to just somebody who was basically another academic. I really wanted somebody to have that kind of skill set that I had learned so much to appreciate from the State Department and the Foreign Service officers, that I wanted to be able to continue that kind of collaboration. Steve had never been an academic, and so when we were interviewing, it was a good fit, somebody who understood him and the world he was coming from. And I knew that he knew where I was coming from, but I could add the academic piece. And so you can be that bridge. So think about that. One of the things that, Fred, you were talking about, that the skill set that so many in the State Department and Foreign Service officers have is communication skills. And that's one of the things that I think is vital, regardless of what role you fall into. But the skills that you learn in handling crises situations and being able to articulate them. So you can think about being on communications teams. You can be thinking about being part of federal relations. You can be thinking about any sort of institutional advancement, where your diplomatic skills of being able to articulate and express very complex situations in a way that is very much avoiding any hot button words, understanding audiences, understanding the clearance process, understanding all of that is a vital thing that you want to think about and highlight in looking for the roles that you're looking for. So you might be more in the legal team, in say the provost's office or a dean's role, thinking about that idea of not only federal relations, but the person in charge of agreements. I think we have 347 international agreements, and we have people looking at those kinds of things. So there's a whole office within the provost's office that's involved with that. So again, that's kind of another role or another possibility that you might be able to have in terms of your skill sets and the ways in which you've developed that kind of communications, understanding international agreements, MOUs, all that kind of work can come into the foray. And so you want to think about that in terms of how you might want to present those kinds of cases. The other issue that I think is so critical to so many institutions is the town-gown relationships. And this is again where those diplomatic skills that you have cultivated between, say, embassy and the community, thinking about, sort of the Fulbright world, being that cultural ambassador, understanding how you can engage in the community building process. So you may find yourself that really the opening may be something in student affairs that touches with the community, and all of the work that you're doing or have done perhaps in building those kinds of relationships and the messaging that's involved in working with communities, understanding how both the faculty, staff, and students at your institution may find ways to engage with the local community and de-escalate anything that might have been going on between town and gown and furthering those relationships. And that's another skill set that I think you want to think about and highlight and look to see how you might want to work in that kind of direction and that kind of community. One of the things that's really exciting about UVA is the way they integrate international students into the community through a variety of programs that have volunteers helping them with their English speaking skills, understanding, working with them to be international teaching assistants, but also about understanding American culture. And so I think that's where you would really want to help emphasize the kind of work that you're doing. And then finally, I really wanted to highlight one other aspect. So much of the work that you're doing, especially if it's on the international side, is about promotion, marketing, talking about, US priorities. And so there can be a variety of ways in which you might think of yourself as being part of an institution that is about promotion, recognition of that. We have a whole global affairs team that does global initiatives that's primarily about getting out the word about UVA. And so there's global communications teams, for example. There's global advancement teams that are working with alumni offices. So all of those kinds of work that you might have been doing in that regard about the communication directed towards promotion, towards marketing, might help you also consider positions in that line of work as well. And I want to keep my remarks brief because I really look forward to getting to the Q&A.
Great, thank you so much. I particularly appreciated, Dan, your comments about developing that town-gown relationship, and I hope we can get back to it in the Q&A section. And also your comment that in a sense you can continue to serve as an ambassadors in this context as well. The art of representation and representing a country, its values, its institutions is not something that stops when you enter the halls of Academe. So I really appreciated that comment. With that, let's turn over to Amir Reza, who will give us a few remarks before we then open up to Q&A. Amir, over to you.
Thank you, Vivian, for the kind introduction. It's an honor to be with you all. And Fred and Dan, you are hard acts to follow here. I don't have that experience outside of academia and higher education. So I bring, I think, maybe perhaps close to 3 decades of working at different institutions of higher education and also how other organizations like the Association of International Education Administrators might be pathways for you to think about both professional development, but also how we might think beyond like university adjacent. Anyway, I also want to make sure what Fred said, we're here to uphold each other. So please find me on LinkedIn. We can continue the conversation beyond this. It is difficult to try to encapsulate what US higher education looks like in just a few minutes, right? Because we've got this scenario, we've got 4,000 plus institutions of higher education with great variety that Fred mentioned. So to try to say, this is what it looks like, this is what roles look like, this is what internationalization strategy looks like. So in other words, a small community college that's really mandated to look locally, be a public institution facing is going to think about internationalization very differently than a private selective institution like Babson College, which everything we do, our ethos is global and international. So you're going to find different roles and opportunities there. I think you might ask, why consider even international higher education? I think you have an opportunity as you enter this space to shape institutional strategies that can influence thousands of individuals, learners, that can really profoundly change the trajectory of our country and the way in which we engage with the world, which I know you're committed to. There are clearly roles I think we might think about. A lot of times we think about international students or study abroad, but there are many, many opportunities beyond what we might call mobility, right? Right now, there's a great deal of conversation. The vast majority of US students don't study abroad, but they need global learning. And there's a whole theme of work around globalization at home. right? And I think you can significantly contribute to that, and I'll get into that maybe in some of the Q&A. Clearly, your diplomatic experience in policy, negotiation, planning, cultural intelligence, as has been mentioned by others, is going to be critical to both strategic planning for global campuses, whether it's here or institutions thinking about setting up what we call transnational education in other parts of the world. Partnership development, compliance, and risk management has become more and more central to some of the work that we do. Um, Ultimately, I do think that you need to go back to kind of thinking about your network, but also who you're competing with as you think about this landscape. I co-authored a book for NAFSA called Careers International Education, for really more for beginners in the field. But it's amazing that I would say 60% plus of people who land jobs do it through their networks, of course, through their competencies and skills. So I cannot overestimate the importance of what Dan said, reaching out to people who you may know in the field, but also beginning to build that network and growing it, but also understanding the kinds of jobs you're applying for, who you're competing with. If you're going after a job that's very technical, let's say in the international student and scholar services field, to Fred's point, but you have zero experience in terms of F1 and J1 visa experience, you're competing with people who have master's degrees that have encapsulated training and work in that regard, perhaps have had a couple of internships. So I would try to stay away from things that are not going to be your strength and advantage, because just because you have the international experience, doesn't mean that will be widely accepted. At the same time, I want to kind of nuance a little bit some of that hierarchy that Fred mentioned within academia. I do think that as we think about staff and administration, there's also hierarchy within that. I think if you have significant years, decades of experience, you can come in some roles. I've seen certainly former ambassadors and others enter academia as senior international officers. These are individuals who are leading very complex organizations in terms of the global strategy of the institution. At the director level, you're more likely to manage mobility programs, specific programs in intercultural learning, while there are also lots of opportunities, I think, in policy and compliance specialists that are navigating either visa, accreditation, regulatory frameworks, more and more complex issues. And of course, I think beyond that, universities are thinking about their learners not just through the lens of undergraduate and graduate students, but also executive education, global lifelong learners. And more, they have a need for people to do either business development or work in terms of international collaborations, and leveraging your diplomatic networks and your skills will be critical to those organizations. Clearly, I think it's important as you embark on this to become familiar with why do institutions of higher education internationalize? They don't do it simply because students should study abroad or it's cool to have international students. They clearly are driven through their mission that institutions who fail to internationalize perhaps get left behind or are not as competitive today. So I think this is where you can really dig into what is unique about that institution's internationalization and how you can uniquely contribute, because each institution will be different. I also want to mention that we don't want to limit ourselves to academia adjacent. There are study abroad providers. I'm on the board of Institute for Study Abroad, CIEE, and there are many others. These are complex organizations which have centers all around the world and with staff who are working largely remotely for them to recruit students, to engage with universities, to create pathways for US students to consider a student study abroad program. Ed tech is coming to the field big time. You know, organizations like Podium and others certainly are hiring. I think there are many ways in which I've seen organizations' growth in which universities are competing with one another for international students globally, and they can't do it alone through their own admission teams, so they're partnering with pathways or partnership programs. And of course, there are organizations like the Institute of International Education, NAFSA, others who are also employing people who both have diplomacy skills, other skills, as mentioned, communication, and are well versed in the global education environment. I think professional development, oftentimes you can actually find a lot of that through networking and engagement with organizations like the AIEA that I mentioned, NAFSA, EAIE, which is a European one. They offer, both virtual, asynchronous, synchronous, and also in person. We have our annual conference in Washington, D.C. in February, AIEA. Those are opportunities to both learn from, contribute to, and engage with stakeholders who will expand your network, but also help guide you. It's a really fantastic field in that over and over, the reason why I sit where I sit is because people have taken me under their wing, they've upheld me, they've shown me pathways, and they've helped me learn new ways to contribute and stay motivated. So I think you will find that it's a field where people, even if you outreach to them, kind of cold call, they'll be willing to have a conversation to try to support you and help you understand. Because most people, I would say all of us get into this not because of the big bucks, but because it's mission aligned, it's something that we strongly believe in, and the more people we have in the field working with the kinds of background and skills you bring, the stronger the field gets.
Great. Thank you very much, Amir. I was particularly interested in what you had to say about thinking beyond the four-year universities to the broader range of academic adjacent opportunities. And the idea that the way that a community college student or administrator looks at global engagement and getting into international affairs is quite different, for example, from other institutions. Really helpful information. So I had a lot of questions myself. I was busily taking notes. We have a couple of questions already lined up from our panelists. But I'll take the privilege of the moderator and launch the first question. And this is following up, Amir, on something you said at the end about a couple of resources out there. One of the things that strikes me about all this excellent advice, about all the opportunities we've discussed in this very short time, is that it's a little bit daunting for people who are new to the field or in the process of transitioning out of the Foreign Service into the academic sector, how to begin to research opportunities that are out there, how to begin to understand, how to frame your experience in a way that's going to make it attractive to potential employers in the academic sector. Is there a clearinghouse, an online resource or set of resources, a place that people looking to move on to the academic sector might go to get some ideas, inspiration, and guidance? And any one of you
I'm happy
take
to
that on.
start, and please, Dan and Fred, help me out. But I think certainly right now we're blessed with the opportunity to use AI, the internet, so many ways in which you can research this. So I don't want to be redundant, but if you're less familiar, I think there are key organizations that are going to be helpful in you understanding what's going on in the field at the moment, what are the hot button issues, and also job boards. So those organizations for me at the moment are going to be IIE, Institute of International Education, NAFSA, which is Association of International Education Administrators, and AIEA, which is more for senior international officers, Association of International Education Administrators. All of them also have job boards. I would other resources that I would recommend, for example, Karen Fisher of the Chronicle of Higher Education has a weekly uh, piece that's called Latitudes. Trying to access that and read it on a regular basis really gives you great insight as to what's going on in the field and what are the hot button issues. And then ultimately, using these organizations plus a few others to really begin to put together a better understanding of, okay, if these are um, the variety of jobs within this field, what seems to be the best fit for me? Now, one of the things that you want to also be mindful of as you read is what is happening in the field, what is growing and what is declining, right? So we do hear a lot about a decline in international student inbound. We do hear about some increase in education abroad, but I would say be cautious in just reading the headlines because again, decrease of international students in the US does not hit those 4,000 institutions evenly. There are institutions that are going to continue to grow their international students in percentage and raw numbers. And so not to discount it just because the headline says, well, the future is not going to be great for international students, right? Similarly, again, there are opportunities here, I think, in transnational education with that means universities trying to set up um, partnerships or even campuses abroad who need strategists, who need employees who actually understand how to navigate those complex environments.
Thank you. I particularly appreciated what you just said, Amir, about uh, taking the headlines into consideration, of course, but understanding that the decrease in international students does not apply necessarily across the board. It's a great reminder and some great advice. Uh, Fred or Dan, do you want to jump in with some additional suggestions as to where people who are in the process of moving on can go for either possible jobs or tips about how to approach the job application process?
From my side, just a quick addendum, and Amir, you really said it, but all of the institutions you named, especially NAFSA, also have courses that one can do. And one way, of course, of not just, sort of getting to know the issues, but also to be credible, is to do a certificate, for example, in some of the specific areas that employers might be looking for to understand what does the visa process look like from an institutional standpoint. How does optional practical training work? I mean, all those things. They're good resources, and it means all of a sudden an institution looks at you differently, right? You have a credential from a place they recognize. It shows your interest, and it can be a way to, make yourself look a little bit different from people who might not have that specific experience. Because Amir is right. If you don't, an employer at a university is looking at you, and there'll be lots of people who have already managed these programs from within higher education. And so to be able to say, no, I actually have a vehicle to say, I know this from your standpoint, I think that actually means something and could make the difference in terms of being, one of the applicants considered versus not, and getting a foot in the door.
No, thank you. That's a great point, particularly about the effort that one has to take to distinguish one's experience from people who are already ostensibly within the field running those programs. What is it that someone coming from outside the academic sector can uniquely contribute to the effort? That's very helpful. Dan, did you?
The only thing that I would also
Dan.
recommend, if it's at all possible, and sometimes it's not, but attending some of those, it's like a NAFSA actual conference. There is the Forum on Education Abroad. And, there's similar to what Fred was saying, there's panels on various topics. And even if you can't attend necessarily, taking a look at the conference schedule and the topics that are there, and this goes back really to Amir's sort of suggestion about networking, looking to see who's on the panel and say, hey, I couldn't make it to the conference, but I saw you did this. Would you mind, sharing a little bit about what you presented? And I'm thinking about getting into the field. It might be a nice way to sort of introduce yourself without directly cold calling. It's something I've recommended to people in the past to look at some of these major conferences. Sometimes the cost of going to AIEA is a little high, but you can see who's all there, the topics that are there, and then you can follow up. So if you can go, obviously the face-to-face makes a big difference, but if you can't, it's a great way to find out who's doing what in the field. And so I'd recommend NAFSA, AIEA, and the forum at least to start out, and others might be able to put into the chat other conferences, but those are the three big ones for me.
One thing I just want to quickly put up. I know, Fred, you mentioned you should not use the word retired, but one thing that's to your advantage at AIA, we just introduced a retiree fee, which is much reduced for our conference. So in that case, please do. And so you're welcome to use that and come to AIA at a much reduced rate.
Great. Thank you so much. I want to come back to some of the points that you raised, but I also am cognizant of the fact that we do have some great questions out there. So let's turn to the first question from my wonderful friend and colleague and a very important member of the Public Diplomacy Council of America, Sherry Mueller. Sherry asks, would one or all of the panelists comment on opportunities at entities such as Semester at Sea or at overseas campuses? Anyone like to take that on?
I shared a little bit about, study abroad providers, so that would be a semester at sea. I think those are excellent opportunities. The types of roles you're going to find what we might call a study abroad provider, like a semester at sea, are going to be regional liaisons. These are people who are employed to work with universities. So if we think of it in terms of business terms, that would be like a B2B sale to try to convince universities that you have a unique offering in education abroad and get on their roster to become an official provider of study abroad for them. They're also within them, their structure, they have almost like a quasi-academic administrative, I guess, hierarchy where they might have a VP for academic. They may have others who are actually center directors who reside abroad and are running programs, and a whole host of other opportunities within that. I do think that the opportunities abroad are actually probably where there's more growth, where we're seeing more and more. I guess maybe if I can back up for a moment. One of the statistics to consider is that today there are about 7 million students worldwide who are mobile, meaning they're seeking education outside of their home country. Anticipated growth is in the next 5 years, it will reach about 10 million, right? What that tells me is that international education is going to actually grow significantly. The inbound to the US is going to be a small fraction of that, where inbound to many other regions, some in the Gulf region, Persian Gulf region, in some parts of Asia, parts of Europe, is going to grow exponentially, and they're going to need expertise, support, help.
Anyone else to have anything to add to that?
Maybe just to say for those opportunities at American institutions overseas, or even institutions overseas, exactly what Amir was saying. I mean, the showing your relevance, your knowledge, but also basic skills. Dan was emphasizing communications, good judgment, managerial experience. All of that is what people are looking for, and to be able to their foreign service experience is directly relevant, and so those positions may be slightly different in terms of what the institution is looking for. I would seek out an informational interview. That's always something you can do. I would not hesitate. Reach out, say, would you be open to an informational interview? It's a way to get more information, to gauge, and in a way to get a leg up, hopefully, in the application process.
I would only add, a couple of things from my limited. I just started at UVA in the fall and made this transition. We've opened 3 new offices already. We're one in Italy, in Vicenza. We're actually hiring. So if you have expertise in South Africa, we're looking for a director and staff and opening up a new office. And our China office is going to expand beyond, and we're looking at something in East Asia. So if you've got experience, be on the lookout for this. And UVA doesn't have a huge global presence in that kind of thing, but we're not the only school that's planning on doing those kinds of things. So if you've worked in the embassy, you've worked in these kinds of positions, this is the kind of person I think universities would welcome with that kind of level of expertise, the whole skill set Fred has been talking about, and being able to understand, getting back to what I was talking about, that town-gown relationship and understanding, because a lot of these positions are you're jointly appointed, usually with another institution or organization, and you've got to be able to be that incredible diplomat who can make sure that all the voices are being heard and all the concerns are being addressed. So that's just the only last thing that I would add.
Great. No, all very, very helpful advice. Let's turn now to our next question. This is from Karen Walker. And by way, a special thank you to Karen, who was, as the panelists know, instrumental in pulling this all together. Thank you, Karen, for a wonderful event. Karen asks, that Dan mentioned volunteers who help international students integrate into the university and its host community. Do you see volunteerism as a viable path toward a salaried position?
I wouldn't put all my eggs into one basket in terms of that. But I would say your ability to work with that kind of community and help people think through that. I think one of the biggest challenges right now is being able to show that the institution and organization that you might be working with is welcoming for international students, that they feel that this is a place that they can call home and that they're not going to be isolated, that they're going to be integrated. And so if you can find ways to host international students for a US holiday, Thanksgiving just happened, we put a call out for the students that we had that were going to be on grounds, and we had an incredible response by the local community to bring people in. We have a center for American English and culture where we're looking for volunteers to come in and have conversations one-on-one with international students to improve their English language skills. We have them be fake students for those who are going to be international teaching assistants, and being a part of that. And this is a way to help understand what's going on an institution, who's working there, and being that volunteer to show how you're committed to this field. I think is just one way of indicating that. I'm not saying that this is the only path, but having that in your wheelhouse does say a lot about your commitment to the communities.
I'd maybe
Anyone
just
else? Yeah.
add,
Yeah.
there's no surefire way in. I agree with you completely, Dan. It's like it really shows, your one's interest. I would just be mindful to turn it into a communications and networking opportunity. That is because the people who are running the volunteer programs aren't necessarily the people hiring for jobs or who are involved. I would make sure that you find out who those people are and try and make sure that they understand what you're doing, who you are. The places are not huge. Even in a big institution like UC Davis, we know each other, and there's a way to communicate. And occasionally we'll get someone who says, we had an expression of interest in being a volunteer. Is anyone interested? It's a great first step, but I would be mindful about turning it also into a networking opportunity if part of the idea is that it might lead to a salaried position.
I would just add that sometimes we think of volunteering through those lenses. You can also volunteer. A lot of times, international officers, within institutions, they have a lot of ideas around research, but no capacity and time to do it. So we hire sometimes graduate interns and others who are able to really help us lift that. And so there are opportunities to work there and volunteer because you're also curious about some of these research outcomes. The other is just temporary employment. A lot of pressures on higher education right now not to add new FTEs, but what I'm seeing is a number of universities having temporary positions that are not going to commit to year after year of employment, but it's a great way to get your foot in the door.
Great, some helpful advice. I'm going to step in again, taking the moderator's privilege, and ask you a question about, frankly, the elephant in the room. We all know that this is a challenging time for American diplomacy, for public diplomacy, and for the university sector in the United States. As a retired Foreign Service officer turned professor myself, this is the question I'm going to ask you is one that I confront on a regular basis with my own students and colleagues at the university where I teach. And that is, what are your talking points? And for those of us who've served in a diplomatic space, you know what I mean by talking points. What is your message? What are your talking points about some of these very difficult changes or transitions that are happening right now? Whether it is the reduction in the number of international students in the United States, whether it is the uptick in visa challenges, whether it is what appears to be a retrenchment or a move back from a full-on commitment to the use of soft power and public diplomacy as an instrument of statecraft, all of these things that we have been observing. What do you say to your colleagues, to your students, to the communities in which you work about these trends? And how do you frame them, and how do you offer hope and encouragement for the future that is there? And then this is a real question. It is something that, again, I confront regularly. And it seems to me that with your experience and everything that you have done, you might have some insights into helping us do that.
I'd love to take a first stab at this. And part of it, I think, is framed by my understanding of the history of IIE, which was formed in 1919 in the wake of World War I by three gentlemen, two of whom were Nobel Prize winners for peace, but most of them were all involved in higher ed and the State Department as well. You might remember then, for those of you who've done some history, the U.S. became very isolationist at that time. There were lots of quotas in terms of the number of immigrants that could come in. It was very much closing the door and saying we were overextended and being overly involved in the world, and we didn't need to be that way anymore. And that's when organizations like IIE and others were formed with this idea of being citizen diplomats. And I think you all who have been real diplomats can take on that role of being citizen diplomats in different ways now. And that's the talking point that I give in terms of what I think students, the faculty who are leading study abroad programs, the faculty who are welcoming international students on campus, finding ways to integrate them into the community. I said, this is our turn to be front and center. We are often on the back burner. We are the ones who are playing the secondary role. And in this time, as we have done 100 years before, it's our time to step to the front. And that's kind of the overall talking point that I have used whenever we have situations like this where history repeats itself.
That indeed, I like that idea of the reminder that the past is present. We have been there before, and that it's our turn to step up. Anyone else like to add to that?
Maybe from my side, I'll simply add, we have a very strong message that it has institutionally, that it has never been more important for our students to study abroad, to engage abroad, for us to establish meaningful global learning opportunities, to link local communities to our students, to stand by research and the value of engaging across borders. So we kind of haven't stopped. I don't think we've sort of taken our talking points and developed them even further. It's never been more important for us to make sure that international students understand that they're not just welcome, but that they're a fabric of our campus's success. That we are not going to stop welcoming them, that we're going to do everything we can for them, that we're going to bind them to Americans, to our students who are local, as much as we can. And so, perhaps it's a slightly different sitting where we are in California geographically in terms of the feeling around us. But we'll feel, quite empowered to make sure that we're sending a strong and a positive message. And that certainly not to be cowed, and not to give ground in terms of the values that we are trying to project. That has not changed. Nothing has changed in the terms of how our institution is looking at this, and we need to be mindful about passing that message to students and to people who engage with us.
Yeah, I love that idea about international students being part of our success, being the very fabric of our success. That's a wonderful talking point. To close us out, Reza, what would you tell us?
I think sometimes in an environment that we're in, personalizing the story and sharing and being vulnerable becomes critical. It's easy for me to do that. I grew up on 4 continents, came to the US as an international student myself many moons ago, and often utilize that as the story, that why it's so important for us to commit to it and why I'm committed to it, to both Dan and Fred's points. But beyond that, as leaders, I think we have a real challenge here, Vivian, as you mentioned, because we have news headlines that hit and affect our constituency, whether it's our trustees, our presidents, our senior leaders, our professors, and our students. And they want to know what the answers are, right? And those news headlines are often not regulation, not policy change. They're just a news headline that sends a ripple effect of panic. And so my advice to my community has been, we need to be super empathetic to that panic while not taking specific action until we understand what is up and what is down. And then being super diligent about our data, what is happening, like if there are travel bans on the horizon, making sure that at a moment's notice, I can say the 19 countries that are on the travel ban, who do I have there and who do I have coming from there? And how do I then ratchet up support for that community first and foremost, and then communicate with the rest of my community to make sure they understand how this impacts us all. That even though if it's 5 students that is impacting, in essence, we are all empathetic and understand that that actually has a ripple effect throughout our community, because that's what international education is supposed to do, right? Humanize, empathize, create that connection.
With the human face on diplomacy, as we said at the beginning of this panel, I really appreciate that response, Reza, because indeed it is the classic response in diplomacy, that is to be empathetic, to understand the situation, but not give in to the crisis or the panic behind it, to stick to the facts, what's real, what's true, and what can be measured and what can be accurately reported, and to communicate the rest of the community with the rest of the community about what's going on. That's diplomacy, that's human engagement, and that is a wonderful way to close out what has been a fascinating panel on these important issues. I am so glad that we are recording this and that we will have a transcript of this, because I think your advice, your insights, and your experience have been absolutely invaluable. I know I will be taking some of it to the classroom in the coming semester. So thank you again for joining us this evening, and thank you to all of you in the audience who joined us as well. and for your thoughtful questions. Have a wonderful evening, everybody.
You too.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.